Join me in the litany based on the purpose of United Methodist Women as printed in our worship bulletin. We are a community of people, young, middle-aged, older, diverse in backgrounds, appearances, and gifts, yet celebrating that diversity. Our purpose is to know God, to know you, sense your joy, share your sorrow, dream of a world where justice knows no favorite, where all walk in dignity, sensitive to each other's needs. Our purpose is to experience freedom as whole persons through Jesus Christ, to reach out and know the wholeness made possible for us by Jesus, even as he restored the broken and the bruised. Our purpose is to develop a creative, supportive fellowship, to share the joys, bear the sorrows, bind the wounds of body and of spirit, to become a caring community. Our purpose is to expand concepts of missions, to confront our preconceived opinions, our prejudices, to extend our areas of concern, to accept responsible action through participation in the global ministries of the church. Not over there alone, but the neighbor in our midst. Not immediate aid alone, but willingness to help change systems. Not for, but with, yet acknowledging the uniqueness of every child of God. Now, some of you know Kim Goddard, and if you've been on the Mayfair website, you're going to know all this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Kim grew up in Giles County, Virginia, on a farm, and I think that's one of the reasons she speaks to me is because I also have very agricultural, rural roots. Finishing high school, she went to Virginia Tech to study, and she did study animal science with the ultimate goal of becoming a vet. But her senior year at Virginia Tech, the Lord called her to a different kind of animal science. He called her to Duke, and she ended up at Duke Divinity School. And we've made little jokes back and forth because I spent 6 years in Chapel Hill getting my undergraduate master's degree at the University of North Carolina, arch rivals to Duke Blue Devils. But not to the Divinity School. There's something special about that Divinity School, so I'm burying the hatchet. Okay? She has served congregations around Southwest Virginia and in the Tri-Cities area. Before she came to Mayfair in June 2006, she was the district superintendent in Abingdon. And some of you might remember a couple of years ago, Sandra Johnson was our United Methodist Women's speaker, and she is the current DS, was when she spoke with us, the DS in Abingdon. So we've had good luck with the DSs or former DSs in Abingdon for United Methodist Women's Sunday. She's married to the Reverend Jim Goddard. So when you call their house, you can't just say, I want to speak to Reverend Goddard, because that doesn't narrow it down enough. And you got to be careful if you enunciate Jim or Kim. Kim and Jim have 3 children, their son Jimmy, 2 daughters Annie and Lindsay, and 2 grandkids. In her spare time, and we know that active United Methodist clergy don't have too much spare time, but it's also their retirement home is built up in Giles County on the New River, on the property of her great-great-grandparents. So 3 greats. She knows her heritage, not only her physical heritage, but also her heritage in the Lord. So we welcome Kim Goddard as our minister today.
It is so good to be here with you this morning, and let me just say it's always good to be with a sister congregation. I love that about our United Methodist connection, but I feel a special closeness to First Broad Street because back in the 1930s, Flem Dobbins and several others who were a part of this congregation looked out at their community, and they recognized that there were people that this particular congregation at that time wasn't reaching, and so they took the bold step then to go to a storefront and bring in a congregation there that eventually became Mayfair Church, that a few years later became Mayfair Church on Center Street. So you are our parent congregation, and we exist at Mayfair because of your commitment to reach out and to reach those who were not being reached with the gospel. So we owe you a great debt today, and I am just so pleased to get to be with you and to share with you. I will be continuing a sermon series, I think, that was begun last week, looking at the fruits of the Spirit, living God's way. What does it mean for us to live the way God would have us to live, and particularly to express it through the fruits of the Spirit, patience, kindness, and gentleness. 8th grade was a big year for me. First day of 8th grade, which was also the first day of high school at Giles High School, I received word that the basketball coach wondered if I would come out for basketball. Had never played a day of organized basketball in my life, but the coach was my PE teacher from elementary school, and evidently she thought maybe I could do pretty good with that, and I thought, oh, wow. Have the coach inviting me to come play basketball. We practiced 2 hours after school every day, 2 solid hours, running up and down the court playing basketball for 2 hours. How wonderful is this going to be? So I called my mom. I said, Mom, can you pick me up a couple hours late today and a couple hours late for the next 3 months while we go through this process? And she, not knowing really what she was getting into, agreed to that. And I stepped onto the court ready to choose up teams for us to play. And the coach said, we have a few drills we're going to go through first. Suicide drills, I think they were called. You don't even hold a basketball when you do that. Do you know that? It's just running up and down the court. And so we ran up and down the court, and I got pretty winded doing that. And then there was another drill that they started to do, and it was called a layup. Didn't know what a layup was. I just thought you just shot the ball for the goal, and that was all that was necessary. It became very apparent I couldn't shoot a layup, and so the coach pulled me off to the side down to a basket that wasn't being used, and for the next hour, one of the other team members who had been practicing for the month that they had been practicing before I came into this, and she helped me to learn to shoot a layup. And at the end of those 2 hours, I was more tired, I think, than I had ever been in my life. And I went home and said, don't want anything for supper, I'm going to bed. And the next day, I thought, okay, today's the day we're going to play. Same thing, just new drills. And this went on for several weeks. And I thought, what is this? This is not basketball. This is just stuff. This is mechanics. This is no fun. And then the day came about a month after all of that started for me when they handed out uniforms. Now we're getting somewhere. Got a uniform. Next week we have our first game. And can I just say to you that when we had that first game, even though we lost probably horribly, like we lost 14 out of the next 16 games that season, I loved it. It wasn't about the drills anymore. It was about playing the game. And I took those drills and those skills that I learned early on, but now we're doing something. We are playing the game. And I loved it. Didn't have quite the experience with piano. That same year, my parents invited me to take piano lessons. You know, I thought I would go in and in a couple of weeks I would be playing, just like our organist plays. And I would do it on Sunday morning and listen to the radio and all these beautiful melodies, and this is great. A couple of weeks I'll be doing this. It was that long before I ever got to touch the keys, because there were these things called measures and bass clefs and treble clefs and whole notes and half notes, and they each lasted a little bit longer than the other, and it was like speaking in tongues to me, and I thought, what is this? It was scales, and it was positioning your hands in just the right place, and your left hand did something that your right hand didn't know about, and it was horrible. And then came my first recital in 2 pieces that I had memorized to play. So I went, and I didn't even have my music in front of me, sat down at a piano at First Christian Church in Harrisburg, Virginia, sat down at a piano I'd never seen before, and they lifted up the lid, and there was a mirror on the lid so that I could watch my hands as they played. And the touch was different, just barely touch the keys and they just fall away. And so I started to play. Strange thing I noticed about my hands, the longer I played, the whiter they got. And the more they started to do this on the keys. And I got to the end of my first piece and I realized, I'm not sure how this ends. And I couldn't bring it to mind. And so I thought, okay, I'll just jump up a line, I'll play through, try not to think about it, try not to look at my hands, and I'll just get to the end. And I got to the end again, same thing. I had no clue. So I tried it a third time, and my mom said she was sitting in the back in the pew thinking, I don't think it lasted this long in practice. And when I was just about ready to pass out and fall off the seat, I know that was the next thing coming. It was just horrible. I just stopped, and with my index finger, I went plunk, plunk, and I got up, and thus ended my piano career. I was never able to get beyond the mechanical. And the sad thing is, I never did get past that. And I missed out on ever being able to make music. I think that's what the Apostle Paul is talking about with the church in Galatia. This was a church who readily heard and responded to the gospel. And this was a church that began to grow and to move out. And things were going quite well until there were those who came to them and said, wait a minute. Do you know how to shoot a layup? Have you been running the suicides? What about the scales and the measures and the notes? You know, you have to get all of that down before you can take the next step. It really is about that. If that's not perfected, if the law is not perfected, then you might as well give it up. So you need to take a few steps back. Let's look at the law. That's what's important. That has to come first. And Paul wrote to them to say, not to do away with the law, to say that was important, but to say it's not the most important. No one over the last 1,000+ years seeking to live out the law has been able to live the 613 laws. It just doesn't happen. It's impossible to do. And I think in addition to that, Paul went on to say, not only is it impossible to do, it's boring. It's no fun. If all you do is, if in basketball, all I ever did was learn to shoot a free throw or a layup, and I learned to do the drills, and there was never a game, what's the point? What's the point? And that's what the Apostle Paul is saying to the people here. What's the point of trying to live up to a standard you're never going to meet if you don't allow the love and the grace of Christ to transform that law into something that's living and that seeks to live in you through the person and the power of the Holy Spirit? Paul went on then to talk about those fruits of the Spirit. This is what it looks like, he said. Living the faith is not just sitting in the pew or not just sitting in church and trying to be nice. So what? What have we accomplished with that? The point is living our lives through the fruits of the Spirit that help us to be active in our faith, to put points on the board, if you will, to make a melody and to sing of God's grace in such a way that it touches and it changes and it challenges lives. So what does that mean for us, this living by the fruits of the Spirit? Particularly, what does patience look like? What does it look like to be patient? Is it standing in line at the grocery store when the 14 people in front of you are all taking longer than they ever should, and it's the first day for the person who's working, and you just stand and smile? Is that all there is to patience? Patience looks like Nelson Mandela to me. In his autobiography, The Long Road to Freedom, he talked about spending 27 years in prison in South Africa. And then the day came for him to be released. And they came and got him, and he got dressed and walked out and got in the car that was waiting for him, and there was the long drive from his prison cell out the front gates of the prison. And he said he realized in that drive that he had a choice to make. And his choice was whether or not he would be able to leave his hatred for his captors inside the prison. Because he knew that 27 years of waiting for that day would all be null and void if those prison doors closed behind him and he carried his hatred with him. Friends, that's active patience. That's taking the suffering and not allowing it to take your soul. And he rode out the gates of the prison, and he left that hatred there. That's what life in the Spirit looks like when it's patient. Life in the Spirit, when it's kind, has the face of a 72-year-old guide in the Holy Land. His name is Sod. And I had an opportunity back several years ago to go to Israel. I wanted to see the places of the Bible. I wanted to watch them come alive for me. I wanted to see the places I talked about and I read about. And I got to experience all of that. But can I just tell you that I saw kindness in a way that I'm not sure I'll ever see it again in Sod. Sod lives in East Jerusalem. He's Palestinian. He spends his life taking people around to these most holy sites. He knows more scripture, has more committed to memory than anybody I have ever met in my life. Seminary professors, preachers, me, anybody. He knows it because it's a part of who he is. It has to be. It has to be. Because he's a Palestinian living in East Jerusalem. And he never would have said a word about any of that until I started to question him off to the side. And I heard a little bit about his life story and how difficult his life has been. And then he said this to me. He said, Kim, I have decided in my lifetime, in my life, I will never allow anyone to do anything that would cause me to see them as my enemy. That's not passive. That's not a choice he made one day and that was the end of it. That is a conscious, willful decision he has to make every day of his life, every time he steps out his door. That's what kindness lived through the Spirit looks like. We all know Libby Deering. Probably there's not anybody here who doesn't know Libby, or at least you know her story. When it was time for her and Fred to retire, they could have gone any place in the annual conference they wanted to, built a nice home, settled down. They could have done the traveling they wanted to do and just had a nice, relaxed time. Libby decided instead that she would ask Fred to follow her now. She had been following him for a lot of years. Now it's his time to follow her. And they would go to South Sudan. And there Libby would gather around a group of children, and she would become their mother. And she would do everything in her power, everything that was necessary to provide for them not just her loving arms, but a home called Grace Home for Children, where these children and more to come have the hope and the promise of a life where they can be healthy, where they can be educated, where they can be loved. What does gentleness look like? It looks like Libby Deering in South Sudan. So how are we living God's way? Is it enough for us just to sit back and be passive and not do anything really bad? Or are we actively living out those fruits of the Spirit? Is there someone God is calling you not to just passively tolerate, but to actively forgive? What are you doing about that? Is there a situation that you know of? Is there some conscious act of gentleness that on your part that would change your corner of the world? I just said a few moments ago that Mayfair Church exists because this congregation said, we're not going to sit back and just open the doors and say, y'all come. We're going to go to where the people are, and we're going to offer them the grace and the hope of Jesus Christ. Are you doing that now in your individual lives? Are we living God's way? Patience, kindness, gentleness. It's not about doing the drills. It's about playing the game, living the life God's way. And may He give us the grace and the courage to get in the game. Amen.